How is the UK coping with the prospect of the coronavirus pandemic? Jay Martin, political expert, talking now about the situation and how it is affecting us. The insights of Jay Martin on our world. Society and politics. The Jay Martin interview. Anyway, I'm welcoming Jay Martin. How are you feeling? You're not feeling like you're developing the virus or anything?
Well, I hope not. If you hear me coughing, I think that's more to do with smoking than anything else. But it's funny how you mentioned the masks. I was reading, someone was telling me actually how they'd witnessed someone wearing a mask. I think it was in Aldi, and had then taken the mask off to kiss their, presumably their other half, and then put the mask back on.
Oh, right,
so totally defeating the point.
So that kind of defeats the point. And I know you've got quite a lot prepared about this. You obviously won't be feeling that the UK is responding very well. What's the first reason you don't think it's responding very well?
Well, I mean, you just need to have a look, not that far overseas, to see what's happening in Ireland, France, even Italy, let alone China. I mean, I could go through a long list of countries. I think I'd just save time and say that the US and the UK, the response is woefully inadequate. I mean, I suppose, what are they doing? What's the response of the UK government? There doesn't seem to be any. So yeah, I've got quite a bit, lined up in terms of not just research, but also some of the day-to-day questions that I'm getting in my line of work, which I'm hoping that we can look at the facts rather than looking at the froth.
Right. Yeah. So, it's been around, hasn't it? This strangely named virus since just before Christmas. That's when we first heard of it. We thought, oh, maybe it'll stay in China, but actually it didn't. Of course, that was wishful thinking, obviously. And it's got a strange name as well, something to do with light, corona, the sun. I don't know, coronavirus. I mean, there's also there's competing theories about why it might have really started as well. I mean, one is the simple idea that it crossed from animals, but the other idea is that it was perhaps created in a lab. I mean, this may be just straightly into the realms of conspiracy theory, and it's got out, and it's part of some sort of agenda. But we don't, what's your actual thoughts on that? What do is this virus what they say it is?
There's the question I was hoping to avoid. I have my own private thoughts about where it originated. I think there's certainly a lot of questions to be asked and not many answers. It does strike me as unusual that it's you've got sort of biolabs in China and what have you. But I think I'll save speculation for another time and just have a look at what's happening. Yes, we know medically. But yes, I think in the absence of any answer and a lot of the way that the virus is behaving generally, not affecting or disproportionately disaffecting younger people is very odd. But you mentioned about the corona element of it. I think, from what I understand, that's more to do with what the virus actually looks like. Just to go through just some of the basics, really. And if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs, I'm only doing so because, there doesn't appear to be any cogent or any accurate information out there. So, firstly, let's call it what it is, which is COVID-19.
Yes, that's the name, isn't it? The official sort of name. Why do they even need two names? Apart from the fact that you say that if you actually were able to have a look at it under a microscope, you'd say, that's the idiot there. That looks like corona. That looks like this light corona, and that's why it's been given a nickname of coronavirus.
Yeah. So it's officially called COVID-19, and it affects your lungs and your airways, basically. And COVID-19 is caused by a virus called the coronavirus. It's sort of a family of various viruses. So, like I say, it's officially COVID-19. It's called novel coronavirus. You might have heard this. The novel just meaning it's brand new. So what we know about it so far is about 20% of confirmed cases have been classed as severe or critical. And as I say, it's caused by a member of the coronavirus family that's never been encountered before. So, like other coronaviruses, there is a general belief out there anyway, whether it's lab or not, but if not, then it's most likely come from animals. To date, figures from 14th of March, and just bearing in mind one of the criticisms of the UK's general approach is there's very little testing taking place, but officially figures are there's 1,140 cases as of 14th of March, but that could be, in the absence of testing, maybe as high as 10,000.
Yes, and is that you're talking about the UK there, or you're talking about the in general?
No, the UK.
Just the UK. So that's just this little island here. When you say animals, I mean that it seems to have been closely linked with these images and the videos of some Chinese people who have ate live bats. Is that directly linked with coronavirus? The idea that it might have come from bats, or is it just animals and nobody really knows? It's a so-called zoonotic, as in a disease, as in it will spread from animals to human. But no, does anyone actually cast iron know where it has come from?
To my knowledge, there is a belief that it's come from bats. To medical doctors, so I'm not going to go any further with that. Generally, if it's come from animals, from what I've read at least, it does appear to have come from, the idea is a bat, but then again, there's a lot of that influenced from videos, that's 3-4 years old. So, if it's coming from animals, I'm sure there's many people better qualified than me to answer that. But like I say, I mean, if we come back to it, I mean, it's not unusual for there to be sort of interchangeability with some illnesses between species. You look back to the plagues, for example. They were carried, well, not necessarily by rats, but could be by dog fleas and things like this. So there is a sort of piggyback method in which we can become infected from all range of things. I mean, we share this planet with more bacteria than there are species of animal. So, it makes up the large portion of the variety of species, bacteria and viruses. There is a difference between them. So far, this particular virus in the UK seems to be affecting between 15 and 20% of hospital cases in the UK are classed as severe. And there's a lot of panic around this, and especially with things like death rates. And so far in the UK, the figures are between 0.7% and 3.4%, depending on the location, culture, and access to hospital care. That's globally. And it has, so far, along with some of its, let's say, cousins, rather than, other direct types, but things like MERS, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which had a fatality rate of about 30%. SARS from 2002 outbreak there had a fatality rate of about 10%. So it's still a significant threat, and so far it is believed from Peking University, the School of Life Sciences, and the Pasteur Institute at Shanghai that this particular virus is developed into two major lineages or two major strains, which are dubbed the L strain and the S strain, or the L and S types. Now, the older variety of this is the S type, and it appears to be much milder and less infectious, whereas the L type, which seems to have emerged later, is spreading quickly and accounts for around about 70% of global cases, or certainly that was the situation at the beginning of March. So that's what we know about the virus. And in terms of practices and advice, which I think is important that we get this before we start looking at the knock-on effects that this is going to have. General advice from the National Health Service is if you've got any symptoms such as high temperature or feel hot to touch on your chest and back, or you've got continuous cough, or you started coughing repeatedly, shortness of breath and what have you, the advice is to stay at home for 7 days. Don't go to work if you've got a job, or try and avoid going out, this so-called isolation. And really that, if possible, to stay away from people, including people in your own home. And that applies, that advice from the NHS is applicant to everyone, whether or not they've travelled.
We've got a big problem. Got a big problem there because obviously people go to work in situations now where they'll only get a small amount of sick pay. There's 0-hour contracts. There's also an increasing amount of people who don't have their own place and are living with other students, for example, in shared living. I mean, I've been reading about these very small flats and shared living in London. And reading an article about how difficult it is to self-isolate in that situation. There's so many people who are in situations where they just won't be able to easily do that, even if they say, oh, I think I've actually got this dreaded coronavirus. There could be nothing they could do.
Well, I was speaking to a rep on Friday who's exactly in that situation. He's actually moved home to look after his elderly parents, and his father's very ill with complications rising from diabetes and what have you. And the idea of being able to self-isolate when you've got someone at high risk is impossible for that person. Yeah, there's lots of real problems with isolation, and I've had a number of conversations with people that in the UK, statutory sick pay, if you're entitled to it, albeit, yes, the government has said you can claim it from day one, is £94.25 per week. And when facing whether or not realistically you could live on that, sustainably, is really, really problematic. It really shows how crucially underprepared we are in this country, not just from a government response, but also, broader welfare entitlements are endemically low and punitive. So you've got a double whammy. Essentially, what we've seen, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is panic buying in the supermarket, where people who have the means to strip out supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, all these barren shelves at Aldi and Lidl, and yet the people with the least means are being priced out because they can't get to the shelves in time. There are significant problems in this country with the way that we treat our most vulnerable.
So you have there a situation where where they're going to have to obviously bring in things to protect people who need the food. For example, stopping people getting too much of one thing, and they've already started doing that. What's interesting though about the government response is they seem to have followed what private companies and organisations have been doing. For example, at first they were saying, they said Boris Johnson's administration, the noises coming out of them seem to be saying, well, we could maybe get people to actually catch it with this so-called herd immunity and see if we can actually get people through it. Obviously, that's a bit difficult if you're a vulnerable person who wouldn't get through it. And then and that they didn't seem very interested in the idea of actually of having big groupings of people stop and really stopping things going. And obviously, it could be because they're more focused on the economy. But then when the likes of the Premier League announced that they were stopping football matches until at least April, and lots of other organisations followed suit, that's where that they were stopping their events with where everybody was going to gather together. It seemed to be only then that they changed their mind on, or seemed to.
Well, if we want to have a look at the government response, not that there's been much, but broadly, broadly agree that in the UK, US, government is being run as a business, and yet one of my biggest criticisms and one of the nature of my work, this is certainly true. My biggest criticism is the way that private companies are responding to this. This has highlighted not just massive flaws within those who are unemployed or can't work and are out of any possible protective net. But people who are in work, you've got to then look at company sick policies, which are laughable, to say the least. We have a situation where people who are in work can get sacked for being off sick a few too many times. I would love to see how company sick policies would cope, and I suppose those who know me know that this is something that I say frequently, which is I wonder how company policies, sick policies, and indeed the government's stance on sickness broadly would have coped during the height of the Black Death. You have this idea with employers who say, people, when you choose to be off sick, the next time you decide to be off sick, and then they're punished for being ill. Mm. Now, some people listening might say, yes, well, we've got people who, take the mickey. Well, you are going to have that with every system, but it doesn't mean because there's a handful of people who've taken the mick, it doesn't mean that should affect absolutely everyone. Now, the government's response, really the only response that they've had in terms of a plan is they've said that they're going to divide into 4 stages this outbreak, or any outbreak it seems, but to contain, delay, research and then mitigate stage. And officially the UK is in the delay phase, which is to try and delay the spread of the disease, moving from a contain phase, which was reducing the spread of virus. Now, the next stage is research developing a vaccine, and mitigate is then prioritising resources. We're way beyond this 4th stage approach. It doesn't make any sense. And the UK government, just so I'm clear for people listening, there are 295 academics, medically qualified, in very senior positions across the UK, who have launched a scathing attack on the government's herd immunity approach. And in fact, who the government seem to be listening to in terms of virology, these experts appear to be more concerned about economic impact rather than that of broader public safety. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, if I put it in a different way, to deliberately infect the UK, this idea that we will then become immune to this particular strain, if I put it in a different way, my thoughts on this is it's a form of passive eugenics. Essentially, it's this idea, a lot of people in government, and certainly in terms of advice, Dominic Cummings, to name one, is and has this economic idea of survival of the fittest, this idea of economic and social Darwinism. Now, that doesn't sound like it belongs in the UK, because I have read about this before. Unfortunately, I don't speak German, so I couldn't quite get the message, but from what I understand, certainly people seem to know quite a bit about the 30s and 40s and the so-called wartime spirit. I'm just wondering which side the government is fighting for, because the idea of subjecting swathes of the population to the realistic potential of death is not something that I think most people who fought during the Second World War would remotely countenance. You've also got other things, just while I'm on this, where you have what's called the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004.
Oh, yes.
That essentially suspends the democratic process and leads anywhere up to martial law, restriction of movement, and the army taking over council functions. It's all very well in times of emergency, but there's very little information about how we restore our democratic processes after the emergency.
Well, that's interesting. So one of the things I've heard is that they plan to possibly postpone the local elections until next year, for example. So
Oh well, they have postponed the
not
elections
just
to
plan
next
to
year.
then.
No, they have,
They have.
and this is the slow erosion really of democracy in times of a crisis. Where I mean, the first thing the government did, in fact, was suspend the elections, mayoral and local elections. So, in other words, what I'm saying is the government's first approach was, well, tinker with democracy rather than provide adequate news bulletins, explaining what the situation was, best medical advice, etc. No advice, nothing like this. No preventatives. We've seen in other countries, suspension of things of businesses like everything from casinos to hotels to whatever else. In this country, so we'll do that when it becomes a problem, and well, it already is.
So what I mean, you could say that it's a more nefarious thing, that they're doing because of the elections, the focus on that. But other aspects of it may be at least similar to what other countries have done, such as in Italy and France. Are you actually concerned about the way that they're handling it there, or do you think that because they're moving towards total lockdowns where you won't be able to go in and out of Spain, for example?
Well, I have a very personal economic problem with the lockdown in France, namely the closure of things like restaurants has meant that my other half is effectively without work. So, but I would rather my other half be alive than worrying about potential contagion, and the potential effects afterwards. I think that, broadly, across the EU, whilst there's been variation in the extremity of the approach, there has at least been an approach. So, for example, some EU member states have supported things like rent controls. That's certainly something that's happening in Italy, where the government has said, well, you don't pay rent. Now, there's not an answer then for how we keep houses lit, warm, and all of that. But at least that's a step in the right direction. There's, today I was just reading that EU member states are going to receive direct funding for their healthcare systems, as well as EU support for firms, and also guarantees for the liquidity of their financial sectors to further support the economy. Without making this a Brexit issue, I'm just going to thank the Brexiteers with another issue that we've got in terms of our health response, which is the serious lack of beds that we've got in the health service, but crucially, the lack of ventilators. There's 5,000 ventilators in the UK for a population of around 67 million people. And European manufacturers of ventilators have said, right, okay, well, we're going to distribute them across EU member states first. New Zealand actually is the major manufacturer of ventilators, and most of their stock presently is going to Southeast Asia. And in the UK, there's only one ventilator manufacturer in the UK. Without putting too blunt a picture on this, we're leaving even things like the European early warning, the epidemic early warning system, which would have provided for some funds directly to people, businesses, government, advice, not just that, but other institutions as well. And if there is a vaccine, because of the logistics that we're still battling, Brexit's still going on in the background, we're forgetting that vaccines are going to take longer to get around the UK or into the UK. So this is a huge problem, an absolutely catastrophic problem for the economy, and really our lack of inaction is we will survive this particular epidemic. Of course we will. And as a country, there are going to be a lot of people who suffer at the hands of this government's inaction. I never thought I'd see the UK Prime Minister say, well, 60% of the population, some of you are going to die, and then walk off away from the podium.
She said that during the live broadcast, more or less, and even though it seemed like a factual thing to say that there's going to be, that's something that's inevitable. A lot of people were taking umbrage at that because didn't seem to be too interested in how we could actually avoid that as an absolute last resort thing that would happen because it shouldn't get to that stage, should it? It shouldn't get to. But it seems like it will happen. It will happen. So I'm just warning you now.
It shouldn't. So what I thought I would do, like with any interview, was to make some notes. So what I thought I would do just now is a lot of people are turning to social media, turning to media for any bit of advice that they can give, that's given, including a lot of folk remedies. So let me just put this into a little bit of perspective, and let me also just say what really the Prime Minister of the UK should have said. So I've spoke about some of the symptoms and the fact that it's been transmitted potentially from animals, but certainly is being transmitted from human to human. As of yesterday, 156,000 people globally have been affected, and that's in more than 80 countries. And that data is coming from Johns Hopkins University Centre for Systems Science and Engineering, and that's based in the US. So there's been just over 5,800 deaths globally. 3,000 of those have occurred in China. However, the part that isn't seemingly being explained is that more than 73,000 people as of yesterday have recovered from this virus. Now, because of a complete absence of information, you have people who are panic buying everything from toilet paper to hand sanitizers, missing out the fact that there is such a thing as soap.
Yes, we've all been reacquainted with that. Oh, soap, my old friend.
There's general panic because there just hasn't been any solid advice given to people. Some people I've spoke to recently, just ahead of this interview, have said that, once you get it, that's it, you get pneumonia. Well, that is a potential outcome, and most certainly for people who have underlying medical conditions from diabetes, heart problems, general lung problems. Yes, that is a significant issue, but people are recovering from this. It's not a death sentence getting it, but then again, don't let that statement underplay the severity of this. And one of the problems with the absence of information is because it's a novel coronavirus, we don't actually know how dangerous it could be until really there's more data. And when I say we don't know, I mean the medical professions, the academics, the doctors, and like I say, they're the ones best placed to lead from a scientific approach. And that approach must be without interference from business too. So when it comes to things like, let's look at this as well, seasonal flu, seasonal flu, which typically has a mortality rate below 1%, causes, around 400,000 deaths each year. We should also start looking at some of the other issues that we don't tackle. And the reason we're not tackling this is, due to choice, because of business, poverty, and the way that we organise ourselves generally in society. But put it into a perspective, which is, we know what the flu does. Please let's not take our eye off the ball with people who might just contract flu and end up very ill and complications. Now, I do understand a cause of concern is, well, we don't know just exactly how contagious this virus is. And crucially, unlike the flu, there isn't, every year I have vaccines for the flu of the year, basically. For this one, there isn't a vaccine. So what it means is it's more difficult for vulnerable members of the population, and like I say, from those who are elderly or people with existing respiratory or immune problems, to protect themselves. And so in the absence of a vaccine, one of the things that I think is that we do vaccinate people who are vulnerable each year, and that might offer at least a little bit of a bit of relief when it comes to this virus. That isn't known, so this is where we're getting the advice for, well, make sure you wash your hands and all of that. Now, my grandma, well, she was a nurse, but I can honestly assure you she wasn't any university doctor. I'd get a clip around the ear if I didn't wash my hands before tea. It's general good advice. And if you've been on the London Underground, I can assure you that advice isn't often listened to.
No.
So yes, it's all of this. There have been other coronaviruses. I've mentioned SARS and MERS, which have been deadly. But that's really how I wish that the Prime Minister of whatever colour would have come out to the podium and said, right, listen, there are a lot of things that are unknown about this. So this is the reason why we're giving advice, which is very general about cleanliness, etc., and making sure that those vulnerable in society are cared for. I would really have liked to have seen some sort of protections for those people who are in care homes, especially, but also for those who are not in care homes, for some support for the carers of those, whose job it is to look after people, along with other broader medical professionals. I would have really liked to have seen that, not the complete opposite, which is, oh, by the way, we want 60 to 80% of you to catch it, and we'll just hope that it works from there. And crucially, one of the reasons that the herd immunity could be an issue is there are some reports from Japan of reinfection. Now, it could be that it's not actually reinfection, and this is most likely, but it's not actually reinfection. It was misdiagnosis when they first caught it.
Not coronavirus in the first place. So, I mean, one problem is that so far it seems that most of the deaths so far have been people who have had an underlying condition or are more vulnerable. But they are experimenting to see only on that basis, aren't they? When they're saying about herd immunity, about exactly who. I mean, there might be certain medical situations that are unknown to where you could succumb. They're talking about diabetes is one of those, for example, that they, so just saying, put this virus out there and just see, we'll all get over it and we'll hopefully be immune to it after that, and
Well, because we're now in this, and this unfortunately isn't something that can be reversed or vaccinated against. We're in a state in the UK, US, and I understand from a very close friend of mine that in Canada and some other countries there is this general panic. That isn't something that we can vaccinate against. People do worry about their future, but for those, I would just say, I'm type 1 diabetic myself. For those who are worried about any complications, general advice would be to, ensure that you've got certainly sufficient food and water, but crucially to make sure that you have a stock of insulin. Now, if there are any type 1 diabetics listening, this isn't something new for us. We have to have a stockpile of of medicine, a limited supply of medicine, because if we didn't and we had to rush out all of a sudden to a pharmacy or supermarket or whatever to get insulin or anything else that you want, that would mean managing our conditions very difficult. And broadly speaking, the obsession with panic buying.
I just lost you there. Hang on. Just lost because I literally lost the phone. So let's just go back. That's Jay Martinson. Hello. We could try switching to Skype now, actually, now that that's happened. Just to see if we can get you. Hello. But luckily, and I don't know why it took about 20 minutes, but Skype came on some way into it, and we were already set up for that. So we can just carry on. You were talking about panic buying, there not being much point to it.
Yeah, well, it's not that there's not much point. Like you say, we're in a panicked phase. We can sort of sense this anyway, that there's a general atmosphere of fear. I mean, God knows how much cortisol's in the atmosphere at the minute, but it's certainly a tangible and very real effect that people have. So culturally, though, we do something a little bit unusual, certainly in Britain and the US, which is some people, when they go shopping, have a big shop at the beginning of the month. Or whenever there's money, be it wage or whatever. And we'll tend to get a little bit more in that shop and then maybe have some top-up shops. Now, realistically, if you have a freezer or you have anything like that, at a pinch, could you last more than 2 weeks? And for most people, the answer to that would be, at a push, yes. Now, because of panic buying, like I say, for those who have the means to go shopping on a regular basis and have the means to go and panic buy, it means for those people who don't do a big shop, who will go to the shop whenever they can afford to. And this is a large swathe of the population, a good 4 to 6 million people on endemically low incomes. When they go into the shops, what they're finding now is that the higher price items are all that's left. And so it's not a case of it's being sensible for your family, nor is it being sensible for yourself. It's actually you're beginning to take food out of our more vulnerable in society's mouths. And that's where the hysteria, some of the sights in supermarkets this weekend have been frankly disgusting. The world is intending this is a pandemic. Yes, there are health concerns. Absolutely. Yes, people are dying from this, and I don't want to accelerate that rate of death by stopping basic access to provisions.
Now, is it so that as I said before, they've already started? There's even been some sort of joint action, it seems, or at least a very similar policy by the likes of Tesco, Asda, and all the rest of them, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, to say you can only have so much of this and that, and they're already seem to be enforcing it in the store that you can't have. You can't just go and clear a shelf out. But that, of course, that's what some of the reports that are coming through in the pictures of a woman in a store, for example, of Morrison's swiping out all the baby stuff, for example. But they're already saying that the supermarkets themselves have already said, we're not going to allow you to do it.
Well, yes, I witnessed something last weekend, though, and I think this weekend's been markedly worse. Last weekend, there was one woman who had instructed her husband to go and get some more toilet paper and go through as a separate shopper. So there are already problems with the the sort of rationing idea.
Yeah. How do you know who's who? Actually, you could have defeated that during the World War II rationing, couldn't you? Actually, how do you know? Well, I suppose they did know who everybody was even then. You could say, "I'll just send my friend in. We'll have as much chocolate as we want." You know.
Well, there were more stringent measures during the war. I mean, for example, for the first time, the working class had access to the food that was the reserve of the rich because it had to be redistributed. And certainly family ration books, very different time. Tesco, for example, that has begun rationing some things, doesn't seem to have thought out that when, as one video I've seen, one recording from a supermarket nearby here, it seems that the family are ready to do individual shops to sort of get around these restrictions. It is. I'm not sure how someone is going to go through 1,000 rolls of toilet paper in, within a month. I might suggest.
Yeah, I can think of a few things. We can't really say them, can we? I mean, in relation to self-isolation. I mean, it could even be a serious point with some people, but we don't. What the association seems to be, perhaps subconsciously, that it's a disgusting virus, and even though it has no symptoms relating directly to that, and you could use the shower or the bath, if you did run out. Whereas with food, when you've run out of that, and water and such like, you're actually in a lot more trouble than when you've run out of toilet paper. So it does seem a bit of an unusual focus on that, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and we're talking about sanitary products ranging from soap to personal hygiene and what have you. It strikes me again that we're talking from a government that seems to be obsessed with the wartime spirit. That there is a gross and endemic problem in this country of homelessness. Of people who can't, wash their hands every 20 minutes, sing happy birthday, or anything like that, for that matter. And it's to those that we are only as strong as our most vulnerable. Again, something I would have liked to have seen, if you want Napoleon Bonaparte, who said a leader is a dealer of hope, I would really have liked to have seen leadership like that. So yes, coming back to it, it really is an absence of leadership that has led to people taking a form of sort of vigilante action, if you will. I'll have to look after myself.
But also, we're going to have to pull together more as a community, just as we did, as they say happened during the World War II era, the Blitz and so on. If there are vulnerable people on their own, if there are people on low incomes and they need food, we're going to have to, and elderly parents, so we're going to have to all pull together to make sure that they get what's needed, but also to be able to, and for the right people to stay in self-isolation. Because as you said before, we've got all the problem with people on 0-hour contracts and I've actually had somebody saying that because sick pay is so low, it wasn't directly related to coronavirus, but just before, he would be prepared to go in with a cold because he would have to, because he needs the regular wage. He can't take a drop in the wage, and that's all because and that's we actually get this as a problem before this has come in. We actually get that as the standard thing. Another company has a sick bonus, which means that it rewards employees who have not taken days off sick with hundreds of pounds at the end of the year. And with that again is going to encourage people to go and spread a virus, and it's led people into this behavioural way of being before we've had such a massive crisis.
Well, this is something I see day in, day out, especially for contractors, for example, where you have the companies do not offer they do not offer company sick pay. They're reliant on statutory sick pay, where you have the issue not of absenteeism but presenteeism. So people turning up to work when they're ill because they can't survive without their regular pay. So yes, this is maybe it's uncovered a bit of the rot that we see certainly in the trade union movement day in day out. And yes, bonuses. Going back to the snake oil salesman Herbert Heinrich. His musings. I'm not going to dignify it with anything more than that. But his musings has led to behavioural safety and behavioural policies that say, well, yeah, when you choose to be off sick, etc. The consequence of that is, yes, companies say, well, we've got a lot of people off sick. For example, there's 2 companies who have a headline sickness rate of 16% and 13%. And they've decided that, it's because people are choosing to be off sick, and have introduced bonuses to turn up to work, as opposed to actually looking at what's really driving that, which is work-related stress, increased working hours, financial pressures, etc. Without actually looking at it, they've then said, well, we'll just throw a token bonus. One company, unfortunately, stopped this recently, but we're giving £10 Tesco vouchers to their staff, but found that it was taxable, so they were receiving £8.67 vouchers. I mean, some of it's laughable, but this is the significant problem. We're dealing with the effects of the 2008 financial crash still. There's not been a great recovery. We've had a decade of cuts, not just to our services, the NHS, fire, etc. But actually, what we've seen is employers in that decade use the excuse of the financial crash to savagely attack pensions, sick policies, increasing working hours, disciplining, sacking people for getting ill on the grounds of capability instead of offering ill health retirement. This is what we're seeing, and again, it's part of I call it's a form of eugenics. If you sack disabled people because they're not capable of doing the job, then the logical conclusion to that is, well, I know a country that was doing this in the 30s and 40s, stripping people, especially the disabled, from work and leaving them then to our so-called safety net. Again, something that's been savagely attacked, universal credit, etc. And yeah, it's a massive problem. We are not remotely equipped to deal with this crisis should it begin to escalate, as everything suggests it will in the next 10 days. Well, even then, I think a conservative estimate is, I don't mean the party, is that we're going to reach peak daily infection in about 10 days. It could be longer away, and could be more sustained. There isn't anything in progress at the moment from government to suggest that there's any way to contain this. Companies, though, certainly large companies with reputational considerations, such as football clubs, have been taking some advice into their own hands, as opposed to being instructed to do so. But again, that scattergun approach isn't what you need. If one company treats its workers better than another, again, I come back to the point, we're only as strong as our weakest.
And of course, if you're on benefits, at least they have now said, at least with universal credit and the ones where you have to go into the job centre, they've now, first they were saying something like, they were saying something so vague it made it sound like you still had to come in, but they've now said that it will be done remotely, not at the job centre. I wonder what would happen when it's claimants without a smartphone or internet access, or any way to, I wonder what will happen in those cases. But of course, if you're on certain disability benefits, you might not have to come in at all, and therefore you could actually self-isolate, except for home deliveries.
Let's just have a look at some of the economic impacts then, and let's start off with the taxi driver the restaurant worker, the pub worker, those who work in cinemas, live performances, amusement parks, in hotels, in airlines, where this panic and contagion, the pandemic as we now are referring to it, when people are being asked on 0 hours contract, waiting by the phone, and the phone call's not ringing, not only have you got an issue then with a complete lack of ability to function, there's no safety net for you, but also those small companies, the restaurants and what have you, that are absolutely being financially crucified at the moment with this. There's absolutely no support for them whatsoever. I mean, just looking at some of the figures, there's an obsession at the moment with the stock markets, and I think I don't need to explain my views on stocks, but some people's pensions and other arrangements, maybe even savings based on it. The FTSE, Dow Jones, the Nikkei have collapsed in the past few days. You've got tourism and travel, just looking at the US, counts for 7% of US GDP. So if you assume then there's a 10% drop, and I think that is incredibly conservative, especially with the likes of Disney World, etc., closing the doors. If you assume a 10% drop over 3 months, that would reduce US GDP by 0.7%. Let me extend this a little further. The interest rates are at an all-time low, so there's very little available to places like the Bank of England to offer any financial stimulus. Without again wanting to panic, let's just have a bit of a reality check here. This is going to be much worse than 2008. If you want a good idea about whether or not there's a looming recession or depression, I personally begin looking at the value of other commodities rather than money. So if you look at gold, which is trading currently at its highest rate since 2013, which is it's trading at $1,570 per ounce. There is a lot. The economic impact of this coming down the line is massive. You look at supply chains. So China makes up a third of global manufacture, and it's called the workshop of the world, which was something Britain used to be known as. It is the largest exporter of goods. The UK is a net importer of goods, about 36 billion in terms of imports in the for the period of 2018. Those figures only came out on the 31st of October 2019. Where the trade deficit was 37.7 billion. We are reliant on supply chains, on not just for exports, but we import more than we sell. And when you have China, for example, closing down vast swathes of its economy to protect its population, the next day supply chains are massively disrupted, and we are closing our back on our closest partner. I will just mention this, a US trade deal could see growth up by 0.16%. We're looking at, but these are government figures, growth down by about 5%, with the threats of just walking away from the EU. We have a significant issue. Another thing that might have been, and if some of your listeners are going to say, oh, well, it's just a Remainer, a very sensible option would be to say, well, we'll pause the trade talks, remain part of the customs union for just another year until we know what the full consequences of this are. Withdrawing ourselves from, various medical warning systems, support systems that we're currently a member of. I don't understand why anyone doesn't think that this is totally lunacy, absolute total lunacy. We've got problems in Europe. The UK is reliant on, just take tourism, for example. There's a lot of people who won't be going away on holiday if you can afford to do that, I should argue. There are a lot of people who are reliant upon tourism in the UK. That is their job. I'm speaking to you from Cumbria, where tourism is a large part of the economy up here. That impact then on the hotels and what have you begins to spiral into effects in the broader economy too.
And then you've got the airline, and Richard Branson's airline was asking for £1 billion or whatever the exact figure was, £7.5 billion from the government because of the effects it's going to have onto the airline. Despite as you were posting though that Branson sued the NHS and now wants something back.
Well, let me give you the facts on the airlines. So far, British Airways cancelled 216 flights between the 16th and 28th of March from London to multiple destinations, from New York to Italy, France, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Ireland. Ryanair's cutting 25% of its flights in out of Italy between 17th of March and 8th of April. A lot of their staff and pilots, do they actually work for Ryanair, or are they on a 0 hours contract? Same with Norwegian. And as for the absolute gall of Richard Branson, who's after $7.5 billion for Virgin Atlantic. Well, let's just look at Branson, shall we? Sued the NHS for an undisclosed figure for losing a contract. His company, Virgin Healthcare, paid no corporation tax on £2 billion worth of NHS deals because it's said that it's made losses since it was founded in 2010. To quote healthcare professor Dr. John Lister, who described Virgin Health as being parasitic, it strikes me that Virgin Health are taking resources from the public sector for their own profit. Their turnover in March of 2019, this is Virgin Health, it was £290 million and is owned by the Virgin Group based in the Virgin Islands tax haven. So I would hope, in terms of sensible government, the option is if he wants help for his airlines, he can put his hand in his own pocket, or he could give us back the NHS that he's taken. Or alternatively, if he is so concerned about his airline, he shouldn't have any objection to a part nationalisation.
Well, like you get with trains, like you get with the railway companies, where even the Conservative government decided to renationalise one railway in the East Coast Main Line.
I would just like to stress as well for Flybe, and not just for the reps, but the members of Unite and the general employees of Flybe, whose company has been allowed to wither and collapse. I would also just say that Richard Branson was nowhere near trying to get money for Flybe or donating or gifting or whatever during its collapse when he had, I think, a 33% stake in that company. So it really is quite offensive when you have multinational companies who don't pay any tax, they don't contribute to the economy, apart from providing for healthcare services for low paid, who often don't pay tax because they're outside the tax bracket, for low paid workers who are trying to help people, so Richard Branson can live in his lovely island as a multi-billionaire. It strikes me as unusual that he should even ask, because the blowback has been significant. But a further thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if the government did end up giving money to Virgin. It strikes me that we seem to privatise profit and nationalise debt brings me on to another issue around the broader economy. We are going to face 2 quarters of deep recession. 2 quarters of negative growth in a recession. Whether that bleeds to a depression is uncertain. We need to have a strategy at the minute to find some way of getting money directly to people. We can't have a trickle-down approach, which is we'll give $7.5 billion to Virgin, or we'll give so much money, because this isn't getting to the people. And my general concern is that we end up in a death spiral in this country where there's no safety net. We've got monetarist policy in terms of trickle-down that doesn't work. And I'd ask people to find me an example of where it does work.
Well, a good example is in Italy, that in response to coronavirus, they've actually made some provisions so that people don't have to pay like utility bills and rent during this crisis, which I guess, sadly, is probably not going to happen here. But it would obviously be a great idea if it could happen. In terms of getting money to people, having to still pay those regular bills when you're not able to do any work, and universal credit, of course, is going to be it's going to have to be relied on by people who are going to have to suddenly become claimants, and more and more people. So,
well, Italy could go further. Offering to pay rents is a positive step, I would suggest, but it doesn't go for electricity and water. Again, there are lots of things that we could do. We've got a shortage of hospital beds. There's 1 bed for every 2,000 people in the UK. In France, that's 1 for every 450 people. We could turn hotels into hospitals if we wanted to. We could take beds from private healthcare providers. There's lots of. We could review company sick policies, recommend duvet days, for example. There's lots of things that we could do. It did, by the way, when I was preparing some notes, I did have to ask a few questions about those people who were already Brexit stockpiling. Are they actually the sort of hidden heroes because they don't need to go out and panic buy? Whether or not there's any examples of that, I just thought that it's just an interesting
and also, when you bring Brexit into it, you're expecting that obviously there could be effects on the economy just from that. Now we've got this on top of it, haven't we? We've got both that and this together. So if there's going to be consequences from that, now we've got them together. I mean, do you think this could push the UK into a sort of second world status?
I think we're already there, to be fair. We don't have global influence. I mean, yes, we turn up to the UN, but we've been walking away we look like we're going to walk away from the European Court of Human Rights, an institution that's separate to the EU. It looks like we're walking away from every EU institution. It doesn't look, the World Trade Organization, which is barely functional anyway, taking decades to resolve trade disputes, doesn't really function. I'd be surprised if that organisation survives, to be perfectly honest with you. I think we're already there. Let's just really have a look at this. If we're looking at supply chains and we've got a situation where the government has gone to tinker with elections for May, presumably it is assuming that there is a problem still going to be around in May, and that's been really one of its first solid acts. It's decided that it's going to push away elections, and then it's briefing that army, security services, and all of this. Now, you see, if that had happened in Belarus, we would be calling it corruption, slow motion coup, whatever. We wouldn't expect this from an advanced country, on those terms of what is advanced and what isn't is for others to define, I should say. But Yeah, I think we're already there.
Now the Civil Contingencies Act is 2004. That was obviously brought in by New Labour, and you say that's the powers they're using to postpone the local elections by a year. What are some of the things they can do with that then? How far can it go with that?
Um, well, there isn't really too much that they can't do, I suppose. If you look at some of the provisions, so what it says is it gives powers to the government, so it can formulate legislation by the Privy Council under the royal prerogative if an emergency has occurred or is about to. It means ministers can make regulations if it's not possible to get an order. What's called an ordering council. That's the Privy Council. So if it can't meet, a minister can legislate anyway. Some of the things that could be brought online are restriction in movement. Yes, if there's collapse in, local council, local government, then the army can step in. Really, it's that's a horrifying dystopian. It's always been in the back of my mind that this is something for the dystopia section of a library. Actually, it feasibly, I think we're as close as we're going to get to this. If this continues to get worse.
Well, there's been an article talking about, basic, but still doing the things that have happened actually in other European countries. So if we do see them as more progressive, which is to stop large gatherings of people, that could include obviously any dissent against the government, as well as the entertainment reasons to gather, such as in concerts and cinema, football, but also protests as well, like the yellow vest, for example, wouldn't be something that would be exactly compatible with coronavirus. The yellow vest protests have been going on in Paris, and obviously over here we've had quite extensive Extinction Rebellion action on the street of particularly London. Is it the civil? Yeah. Sorry, I'll just say about this. Is the Civil Contingencies Act able to stop all that as well, as has been at least rumoured in the article?
Yes, one of the things that the government could do is draft in bouncers and people who have gone through their qualification, gone through their training courses to be bouncers, can draft them in as sort of civil militia, that kind of thing. Just on the yellow vests in France, well, actually in defiance of an order preventing large numbers in France, the yellow vests have still been out.
Even during the coronavirus, this March.
Yeah,
they're still there. They're still there. Yes, basically at the moment they are there doing it.
I mean, there is another problem with sort of comparing countries in this way. So, for example, there's been some commentary about the relationship between, Italy's quarantined and, it's seeing its cases, continue to increase, 25% increase there. And, China, they did that. Well, actually, no, they're very different. Quarantine measures in Italy, it's families that are under quarantine. In China, it was individuals. So, and when you look at the minute, 86% of those who've caught the virus have done so from a family member. We can't compare the cultural sides and what's happening in one country to another. But more broadly, I could see much further restriction in the UK compared to France, where there is a cultural tradition of holding truth to power. In this country, you put the X Factor on and people go, there we are.
Oh, I'm staying in tonight. Don't worry about your protest, or even get them to go out and to go to local music might be, But about the infection, about the way that it sounds like you're more likely to gradually catch it off a family member than just from meeting people in the street or being at a football match with them. But when just going back to the science of this COVID-19, how much of a risk is it? Would it be actually in large gatherings? I mean, can you sort of keep yourself to yourself a bit? Keep not get too close to someone. Will that do, or will it be it's not. Will it be similar to cold and flu that seems to be just spread by being on surfaces, by catching the breath of somebody, you know, and all that airborne?
Well, from what I understand, it's transmitted through droplets. So, you know, if you're outside and keeping more than a metre away from someone, it should lessen the impact of contracting this. You know, and I suppose if you're wearing gloves and masks and whatever else, you know, that does offer a degree of protection. Ultimately, I suppose it's like with any virus, the best way to weather a particular storm is to, you know, isolate yourself. We tend to do this if we're off sick. We you know, if you're really ill, you tend to, you know, stay at home and avoid others. You know, that seems to be the way that we operate more generally. But restrictions in rights to protest crosses a line between public health, and it goes into that basic right, which is to hold truth to power.
Which, you know, it's kind of, you know, there's only not so much fringe groups, but there's a minority of people in the UK that seem to actually get on the streets anyway. But there are people who will do that and will dedicate their lives even, you know, or significant portions of their lives to things like Extinction Rebellion still here. So, you know, interestingly then how they're going to clash with authority should there be a total lockdown.
Well, if there is a total lockdown, I suppose it would mean people aren't reading things like the Daily Mail or the Sun, unless they have that delivered to them. So actually what it could lead to is people waking up from the nonsense of those papers and beginning to form their own opinions. I mean, that could be something that happens. You know, I'm just broadly just reminded by something that I said during our interview back in December, where I said that at the end of the programme, you know, the government's not going to come to help us. We are on our own. And this is really why it is that we're having this conversation.
Well, yes, and it could have been very different. I mean, had it been, say, the opposition, presumably that it wouldn't have been perfect from them either, but it would have been very different at least.
Well, no, some conservative, someone who identified as being right-wing had posted an image on Twitter showing some shelves at Tesco, saying, well, we're now experiencing what it would have been like under Jeremy Corbyn. And you can appreciate the complete irony of all of that, namely that we are experiencing it under Boris Johnson.
Yes, and he's posting that we are experiencing it now. What have you seen anyway? Like you said that I haven't even seen any supermarkets this weekend, so I've been remarkably self-isolating between just going to radio stations. But you know, what sort of scenes even in your small town in Cumbria? I mean, I can't imagine what it's like in cities right now, because I remember somebody, a mate that works at the Costco, for example, said it was mayhem last Sunday. What have you seen today?
Well, yeah, I don't think you meant to, but I should imagine if anyone's listening from Cumbria, I would need to just say, well, Carlisle's a city.
Yes, I did realise that, but it's smaller than Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham and London. I suppose that's one thing we can say.
Well, we can. We still matter up here, though.
Yes, you do.
What I've seen in this morning, so I had to go to a tip, and actually was looking to get some cigarettes, and let's just say the people wearing the masks outside of Asda, I didn't go in, people carrying vast amounts of shopping in trolleys, you know, cars absolutely stocked up. And then at Aldi, I was looking just to get some milk. It looked like something from a war zone.
So it's a bit like the Black Friday thing, where people are desperate to get the bargains. We're sort of seeing people desperate just to get ordinary things like milk or, well, toilet paper, as we've so famously been talking about. So it's like bringing the Black Friday effect to ordinary products, isn't it? Ordinary shopping.
It is, yes. And the idea that, realistically, if you look at what people are doing by selling these products online, it looks like toilet paper is more valuable than the notes you've used to purchase it. It's a very unusual situation to really be in, whereby people are happy to pay vast amounts for toilet paper than anything else. But again, it just comes back to that general hysteria. So I think my overall comments with this have got to be that one of the things we shouldn't do if we are looking to ourselves is to just automatically accept because someone has put something into a meme or an image or it's been shared, even by people we might trust. Well, if you do this, then this will cure it or whatever else. So I've had to speak to a number of very intelligent, well-meaning people who've been sharing folk remedies such as gargle your throat with vinegar or with salt or with anything else like that. Well, the problem there is that most certainly isn't any medical advice that's coming out from my GP, for example. But what it has led to is I had one report earlier today of someone who was trying to get some salt for their caravan and couldn't. And seemingly this was in Home and Bargains. And basically it couldn't do because it seems that sort of folk advice of gargling with salt water as a cure seems to have been passed.
Oh, one advertising, but the idea of using bleach as people taking advantage to put out false rumours deliberately about what might actually fix it.
Well, can we just say to those listening, drinking bleach is not at all in any way, shape or form advised.
Well, that's because it was burn away the esophagus away, which is the tube between your throat and the stomach. But as I said, it's just that it creates this mass hysteria where almost anything goes and people will take advantage of a situation. I suppose it's a kind of form of, almost a form of looting, but by putting false advice out on social media.
Over human history, we've developed religions, we've developed practices over the fear of the unknown and fear of nothingness, the unknown, however you wish to phrase it. People are frightened of the unknown here, and as such are looking to remedies, to turning around 3 times in front of the mirror, whatever it might be, as opposed to really, yes, there are questions we don't have answers to. It doesn't mean that because someone has said, "Oh, have you tried, burying a kestrel's foot," or have you tried, putting socks near your ears, or some of the other things. I mean, this entire business reminded me of there was a folk remedy going around in the 30s and 40s of a cure for a sore throat, for tonsillitis, would be to use a man's, I don't know why it was a man, but a sweaty sock and to put it round the ear. Well, unfortunately, it did very little for the sore throat, but did lead to some ear infections.
Oh, yes. And one thing, you talked about the economy. and which companies would, of course, be doing far worse and having the knock-on effect. Obviously, travelling at the moment is on an absolute downer. Attending football, some Premier League footballers might be getting a few £100,000 a week less, actually, between now and Easter. How will they afford Easter eggs? We've got that, but what about the, Disney's a great example, because while people might be barred from going to Disney World, they're just about to launch, I'm sure they'll love this advertising on this small station, their streaming platform Disney Plus, where you can watch nearly everything from the archive. And then there's the likes of playing PlayStation 4 and Netflix. I wonder if there's going to be a boon in those sorts of parts of the economy which involve, home digital media and entertainment companies that are going to do better out of it, because people are forced to stay in and are more likely to subscribe at the moment.
Well, most certainly the media are doing very well at the moment. I can't imagine that Andrex or Unilever are exactly worrying about their margins. But we are talking about sections of the economy that ultimately are reliant upon supply. So, someone said, well, I don't read The Sun or anything like that. So when I said, well, you have admitted that you watch Sky News, you're still watching the adverts, you're still, providing money to Murdoch and what have you.
Although, admittedly, now it has been sold to, I think, Universal and NBC Universal, so he finally has nothing to do with Sky Television.
Well, there we go. That was a rookie mistake. Of course, yes, you're right.
But because of intermedia and that, I can finally feel a bit less guilty about having it. I'm afraid I do have a Sky subscription, which is something they said about, people in Liverpool may have still continued to subscribe to Sky Sports to watch the football team, which, I'm not so much into football, but that is an inconsistency, unfortunately, with the trying to avoid the Rupert Murdoch,
Well, what I would say as we sort of begin to conclude is to people that, fact check. If something doesn't look right or seem right, then try and fact check it as best as you can. If someone's telling you to drink bleach, just think about that. Secondly, the real message from this interview, the one thing that I would like people to take away is we are only as strong as our weakest component. And this shouldn't be a time for panic buying and affecting other people. But actually, it's the time that we need to really look after each other. If someone's self-isolating, it doesn't take too much to, ask if there's anything that you can do for them. It's just a very basic thing. If you have the means to do so, if you know anyone who's out of work, because of this, and don't have any income, if you can spare some cash, then that goes a long way. We're not going to find the governments, whether it's in the UK or the US, riding into our assistance. We really are on our own. And for those workers who are in care homes, in health, in transport, and all the rest of it, the people who keep our country ticking over, just bear in mind how much work, how little sleep, how much worry that they have too. We really should be, like I say, this should be the point where we're looking after each other.
Yeah.
And that would be my overall message.
I wonder also is how isolated we're going to be, because when I'm talking about the things at home, also that that people are going to be able to read and watch TV, play games. It depends on deliveries, doesn't it? That firstly, the most vital, food and water, and all that. The water coming through the tap, but food and those supplies. But also, if we get deliveries in, from the Royal Mail and parcel companies, I wonder if that could be something that might be affected. Because we're going to need that at home. We're going to need to get things in.
Well, massively. There's not going to be a section of the economy that's not going to be substantially affected by this. The question really, and I'm just bringing it up broadly in terms of the economics, is if we do end up with a collapsing economy, we need to be somehow applying pressure to people to, especially in government, finance, whatever, to say there needs to be money in the system for people to survive. If we end up in a spiral, a depressive spiral, whereby, as you say, the supply chains are breaking down because people can't deliver, or if you work for Hermes, pay something like 17 pence per parcel, and you're turning up to work ill or whatever, at increased risk. We need to be really thinking about this. I can't see, if you have a Sky subscription and you don't have enough income, that Sky subscription is not going to last forever. There's things like this. So, look, this could evaporate in the next couple of weeks, in which case there could be a bit of a bounce, where people start using some disposable income in different ways. The current trajectory is we're about 2 weeks behind Italy.
Yes, which has seemed to have had the most cases in Europe. Is that right?
Italy has, yes.
Okay, so we're just approaching 8 o'clock, and that'll probably bring us roughly to the end of that. And we've seen, yes, that Italy's had some problems as well as some of the good measures. People have they've been so overwhelmed with the just the amount that they've had to leave bodies in the houses where they have had. So let's just hope that the NHS isn't going to get too overwhelmed. But this is because if you're looking for, if you're in there for routine treatment or for anything that you would need the NHS for just at an irregular time, that could be anything, couldn't it? We're just going to have to hope that it can do that and cope with this.
Well, indeed, absolutely. So I wouldn't ask people to hope, but if it really does get to it, then start voting with your feet. And if that means bringing down the government, then so be it. This has to be the wake-up call for this country to A, begin to look after each other, and B, hold government to account like other countries do.
So there you go. It's a call. We're actually thinking, and that has aired on the show, is an actual call to revolution if it becomes necessary at least. But there are obviously, we're going to have to see just how deep it goes into some of these problems. But as I said, people in France are seem to be far more geared towards holding the powerful to account than we do as an overall culture in the UK. So I'd like to thank you, Jay Martin, for your insights over this coronavirus pandemic and sort of what it is, how it's took hold, and what some of the effects that we're seeing as a result of it. That was the insights of Jay Martin on our world. Society and politics. The Jay Martin interview. The interview was by political commentator Jay Martin, presented by Michael Farry. It was a Channel 107 production.